For 400 years, it's had just one name, a name printed on billions of maps, a name we all know. But what happens when a global power decides to just rewrite it overnight? Well, you get a war, a multi-front war. And believe it or not, that's exactly what's happening right now.
And make no mistake, this isn't just about changing a few letters on a map. This is a real conflict, and it's being fought in courtrooms, in state houses, and across international borders. It's a battle over history, identity, and, you guessed it, billions of dollars.
You see, this whole thing is blowing up on 4 different fronts, all at the same time: legal, legislative, diplomatic, and economic. And it all traces back to a single decision. So, we have to ask the big question here. Is this a bold assertion of American sovereignty, or a really dangerous geopolitical stunt that's just spiraling out of control? To figure that out, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the pen stroke that set it all off, then look at the fight over oil and maps, the unexpected war on the press, how the rest of the world is responding, and finally, what this new Gulf of Divide really means for everyone. All right, first up, the presidential pen stroke. To really get what's going on, we have to rewind the clock to day 1 of the new administration. So picture this. It's January 20th, 2025. President Trump signs Executive Order 14172. Now, it did a couple of things, like restoring the name Mount McKinley to the nation's highest peak. But the real centerpiece, the move that lit the fuse on this whole thing, was the official rebranding of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. So what was the thinking here? Well, the administration justified it with a policy they called continental realism. The argument was actually pretty simple. The name should reflect the main stakeholder. And since the U.S. provides the most security, the most investment, and the most technology for the Gulf's energy, the White House argued the name should reflect that. It was basically a linguistic flag planted firmly in the sand. Now watch how this escalates, because that symbolic act very quickly became a powerful economic weapon. You see, this isn't just a culture war, it's an energy war. The economic stakes here are just immense. We're talking about the engine of American energy. A full 15% of the entire country's crude oil production comes from the Gulf. And the administration used that leverage to basically force the private sector to get on board with the name change. And the way they did it was pretty clever, actually. A kind of administrative pincer move. The White House announced this massive new oil and gas lease sale, but there was a huge catch. To even bid, giant companies like BP and Shell had to use Gulf of America in all their legal documents. The message was crystal clear. Use the new name or you lose access to billions of barrels of oil. Okay, next up, the battle for the maps. While the federal government was going full steam ahead, this whole conflict started trickling down to the states. And nowhere was that fight more intense than in Alabama. And that debate in the Alabama House, it was like a perfect snapshot of the entire national fight. On one side, you had supporters arguing it was about state pride and, being loyal to the president. But on the other, opponents were warning of a diplomatic catastrophe, saying, hey, this Gulf doesn't just belong to us. And that led Representative Marilyn Lance to ask the one question that just cut right through all the noise, the question that got to the very heart of the problem. Has anybody talked to Mexico? The short answer was no, and that silence was about to have some major consequences. Okay, so from the states, let's zoom out and shift our focus to Washington, D.C., because this is where the battle over a name turned into a fundamental fight over the freedom of the press itself. So get this. Just 1 month after the order, the White House does something totally unprecedented. They banned the Associated Press from the press pool. Now, the pool is that small group of journalists that gets super close access to the president. I'm talking in the Oval Office, on Air Force One. And why? Because the AP's Global Style Guide said they had to keep using Gulf of Mexico. So the AP sued, a judge actually sided with them, but now the White House is appealing. The whole thing is still up in the air. The judge's ruling was this incredibly powerful defense of the First Amendment. He basically said, look, the government can't just pick and choose which journalists get access based on whether they like what they're saying or, in this case, what words they're using. But the White House's argument on appeal is, well, it's pretty chilling. They're claiming that places like the Oval Office and Air Force One are non-public forums, which is just a fancy way of saying they're private spaces, where the president can decide who is and isn't allowed in. If they win, that could fundamentally change the whole relationship between the press and the presidency. So let's see how this domestic squabble started sending shockwaves across the border and around the world. Because the international response was, well, it was a mix of legal fury and just straight-up sarcasm. The legal argument against the US really boils down to one simple principle of maritime law. A country's control only extends 12 nautical miles from its coast, so the US can't just unilaterally rename the whole thing, because, under international law, most of it isn't actually theirs to rename in the first place. And this has led to this bizarre situation you might call cartographic schizophrenia. Seriously, right now, if you open Google Maps in the US, it says Gulf of America. Open it in Mexico, it says Gulf of Mexico. And if you're in Europe, you might even see both names. The map is no longer an objective truth. It's literally determined by your IP address. It's wild. So, let's pull all these threads together. Let's really assess the consequences of this geopolitical showdown as it stands today. Where are we now in this Gulf of Divide? As of early 2026, to put it simply, nothing is resolved. In Alabama, that bill is about to pass. In Washington, the press freedom case is still tied up in court. In the energy world, that massive oil lease is moving forward, basically cementing the new name in contracts. And diplomatically, relations with Mexico are at rock bottom. The conflict is still raging on all fronts. So was it a success? I mean, if you're looking at it from a purely America first point of view, maybe. The administration definitely forced the world to pay attention, and they even got tech giants to redraw their own maps. But the costs are incredibly steep. A fractured relationship with a key neighbor, the press literally suing its own government, and deeper, more bitter political divisions right here at home. At the end of the day, here's the real takeaway. A name might just seem like a word, but when that word is backed up by executive power, enforced by the courts, and tied to billions of dollars in oil, it becomes a very powerful and very undeniable reality.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Was this a bold, necessary assertion of American sovereignty? Or was it a geopolitical stunt that just went way too far? That's something you'll have to decide.